I'm extremely grateful to Professor Deborah Harkness for joining us. Deborah is Professor of History at the University of Southern California. Her first book, John Dee's Conversation with Angels, explored the worldview and library of England's most famous natural philosopher. Her second prize-winning book, The Jewel House, led readers through the streets and alleys of London to explore and better understand the development of science in England. And her All Souls trilogy reached the top of the Sunday Times and New York Times bestsellers list. And this is a set of novels which draws on her scholarship and weaves together both fact and fiction. So I'm delighted to welcome Deborah here tonight at the College of Physicians, and she's going to talk to us on the Renaissance Library and the worldview of John Dee. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, and thank you for inviting me back to the Royal College of Physicians. This is the first place that I ever held a volume that had belonged to John Dee. The Royal College of Physicians has more of John Dee's books, I think, than anyone else, and so I wanted to start where I would have the most books to look at. And so my life as a scholar in a very real way began in this collection, part of which is on exhibit today and in the library. So I'd like to extend a special thanks to Katie Birkwood, who pulled together the books, paintings, and other objects that you have seen or will shortly see. And I think that for those of us who have had a look at it, we would all agree that her efforts have, like the twist of a kaleidoscope, brought a whole new vision of Dee to light. I'd also like to thank, additionally, Bill Sherman, and I'm going to do that by way of an autobiographical note. In 1990, I set off from America with the intention of reaching a better understanding of John Dee's life and intellect by following the clues he'd left in his library. Unbeknownst to me, Bill was doing the same thing in Cambridge that I was doing in Oxford, namely following the complicated trails of ink that Dee left behind in his books. Trails like this. Some of them illegible, water damage. This is something that Katie discovered on a paste down where Dee's notes have been sort of glued to the cover of the book. And once you peel them away, you can see this is his, what I call very formally, his chicken scratch hand. Beautiful trails of ink like this, where he is saying that he read this book between the 18th and 24th of September in the house of a church official, Edmund Bonner. Trails like this. Little faces that look an awful lot like a bearded, hook-nosed John Dee. And bossy notes like this that kind of call out through the centuries. Happily and completely coincidentally, Bill and I ended up dividing Dee's library neatly in half. And so we never got in each other's way, which is probably why we can still be up here talking about Dee a quarter of a century later and remain friends. So it's a real honor to share the podium with him again, something that we have not done for a very long time. So my task tonight is to talk about the relationship between John Dee, his library, and his worldview. Now, fully contextualizing a man as complex as John Dee during a time of great intellectual change and against the backdrop of Elizabethan England's largest library isn't really possible. Certainly not within a period of 20 minutes, which is what I've got. So the experts in the audience are going to have to forgive me if I resort to highlighting some of the most striking insights into Dee's life and career that are brought to life in the exhibit, the current exhibition. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have that are particular that I don't touch on in our conversation period. So what I'd like to do first, though, is to start with John Dee himself. This is an illustration, part of a pedigree of John Dee, with what may very well be a self-portrait of the man himself there in the black robes. Dee was born in 1527 in a neighborhood near the Tower of London to a minor official in the court of Henry VIII named Roland Dee, who is right here. And Roland Dee was married to a woman named Joanna Wild, And throughout his life, Dee very proudly called himself a Londoner. Here's his name, John Dee of London, down at the bottom. He was also proud of the fact that he was of Welsh descent, which he claimed he could trace back to kings and princes. In this pedigree, which is now at the British Library, Dee appears twice in the role of philosopher, in his title, which he puts here, and up here in his scholar's robes, pointing at what was his personal emblem, which he called his monas hieroglyphica, a symbol of all heavenly and earthly knowledge, which he unpacked in a book. I'll show you the title page a little later. Now, this monas hieroglyphica here really highlights some of the challenges that we face if we are trying to understand John Dee. And it's one that I think has been really foregrounded beautifully in the exhibition upstairs, namely, how do we characterize, how do we categorize this Renaissance man and his work? He was, all at once, a professor of Greek. He was an alchemist. This is his book, The Monas Hieroglyphica, which contains a lot of alchemical information as well as some mathematics and other symbols. He was a geographer, and he was a mathematician. He was an astrologer, and he was a historian. Here he is doing a genealogy of some of the kings of Normandy in the margins of his books. And I think in some ways what many of us know him best for is the fact that he was a man who for a very long period of time held conversations with angels through a crystal stone, a mirror, or a ball. We're not really sure exactly what the technology was, and it may have changed over time. So today we often call John Dee a polymath. It's a way for us to gesture at his wide learning and his wide approaches to problem solving. In Dee's time, he simply called himself a philosopher. That was an equally all-encompassing term, and one that he used with great regularity to describe his interests and the way that he was interested in finding the truth. And so Dee would have been quite pleased to have this portrait in the exhibition. I think this is John Dee as he wished to appear. He looks out from the canvas with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has hidden a great secret behind the red wizard's curtain. If we're very lucky, Dee's slight smile seems to say, he might share his knowledge with us. This is John Dee the Wise, a man of mature years with that long hook nose and an even longer beard, learned, cautious, and prudent. After his death, the residents of the village where he lived longest, Mortlake, down on the Thames, remembered Dee as a man who always wore the robes of a scholar and who walked in his garden with his hands clasped behind his back, seemingly lost in thought, yet always ready to help his neighbors if they fell into a dispute. But Dee's neighbors told other stories as well. This is a broadside of a letter that Dee presented at court to King James, the successor to Queen Elizabeth, where he asked him, the king, to put an end to the people who were voicing slander against him and calling him a conjurer. The neighbors told stories that certainly pointed in that direction. Back in the 17th century after Dee died. They told stories of chemical stills that puffed out smoke and fumes, of children who were afraid to cross him for fear of his reputation for witchcraft, of conversations with angels seen in a crystal stone, of lost items found through magic, and frightful tempests raised. And so it's Dee's reputation as a worker of magic, one that haunted him throughout his life, that often eclipses his reputation as a polymath or philosopher. So whether you remember Dee as a philosopher and scholar, as the Queen's conjurer, or some combination, I think it's useful to remember two features of Dee's character that bring these seemingly opposing activities together and which may not be immediately evident to you as you view the exhibition. They're the kind of things that you get only if you've been reading John Dee books and manuscripts for many decades. And the first one of these characteristics is Dee's approach to his life and his scholarship, which I would describe as an approach that was deadly earnest. In my research, I have never seen him exhibit even a flash of humor, or irony, or anything even vaguely resembling the kind of slightly cynical perspective on life. From his very bossy pointing finger, which still haunts me, to his kind of emphatic note this well up at the top of the page, the margins of his books are really filled with evidence of the fact that he was able to take absolutely everything totally seriously and at face value. And this doesn't mean that he was not intelligent. It doesn't mean even that he wasn't an original thinker. It means that he was incredibly earnest and incredibly focused on his quest. Now, sometimes his sort of deadpan way of interacting with the world makes us today giggle. So I was remembering with Bill, there's a book in the British Library where he was studying Hebrew, and he was trying to wrap his head around the fact that you had to write backwards. And so he'd written his name, John Dee, in English backwards at the bottom of one of the pages. And up in the exhibition, you can see this note, which I just love, no sign, basically it says no sign of the Trojan horse here, so and that makes us giggle, but I think for him it was just a plain observation of the facts of the matter. Now, along with his earnestness, Dee also has another character trait, and that is overwhelming intellectual optimism in the face of overwhelming evidence that he should not be optimistic at all. And this, again, is something that brings his magical, philosophical, scientific aspirations all into congruence. And that's because Dee believed the truth was really out there. And we're talking about the truth with a capital T. Truth about the natural world and how it worked, the truth about what was on God's mind at the moment of the creation, the truth about the religious path that people should follow during a very troubled religious time. And he was convinced that diligent study would yield that truth with a capital T if he was given enough time. Now, he wasn't alone in that kind of optimism. Many of his contemporaries in the Renaissance believed that the advances of the period, with its new worlds and new technology and new ideas, were signs that the ultimate knowledge about the world might soon be there. But many of them got cynical when that ultimate truth didn't quite land in their lap. Dee never did. Dee never seemed to become cynical in the face of disappointment. And for Dee, I think he truly believed that he was part of a great transformation, a transformation that would bring about the apocalypse, which for him was not something to be scared about, but something to look forward to, because it would be a time when everyone would live in peace and harmony. Everyone would go back to an almost Adamic sense of mastery over the world, and all of the sins of the centuries between the creation and his lifetime would be wiped away. So for us, I think, what's most striking is that Dee, having seen the possibility of achieving this truth, believed he could convince others to join him on his quest for understanding and enlightenment. Queen Elizabeth, pictured here in this marvelous late Victorian painting, was only one of the prominent political figures here in England and also abroad in Europe who Dee approached in order to share his hard-won insights into nature, politics, and religion. In the case of Elizabeth, he served as a kind of philosophical and magical consultant during her long reign. Early in her reign, for example, it was Dee who cast the most auspicious day for her coronation. I think that worked out relatively well, all things said. He also was called in by the Privy Council to view a doll that had been found in the fields outside London, stuck through with pins, because the Privy Council was concerned that some kind of evil magic was at work that might put the Queen at danger. He said there was absolutely no danger to the Queen, and everybody sort of relaxed. So one of the things that's been discovered in this exhibition is that underneath this painting, originally, there would be a row of skulls, a sort of a little bit more of a magical, occult touch to the painting than what ultimately ended up in it. And I think that in that case, the painter was really kind of making a reference with these skulls that were later lost to those activities of Dee that were very much about shedding light on the hidden secret parts of the universe. Now, I will say that I myself have seen no evidence at all that convinced me that John Dee was a spy. I think in part, one of the reasons that I'm not convinced about this, but we can argue about it in the conversation period, is that his earnestness would kind of make him ineligible for the job. He was certainly not James Bond swanning around with savoir-faire, in the capitals of Europe. Instead, he was that kind of the one who was always pointing his finger and had something important to tell you, which I don't think would have necessarily made him a great spy. One of the byproducts of Dee's combination of earnestness and intellectual optimism was that he was very susceptible over his lifetime to falling in with other individuals who claimed to be peddlers of important truths, most notably alchemists claiming to possess arcane knowledge of the Philosopher's Stone, and scryers. Now, scryers were visionaries who were employed in the 16th century because they had an ability to see visions in reflective objects. And those reflective objects could include bowls of water, they could include mirrors, crystal stones, and even the polished fingernails of virgins. Edward Kelly is the most notorious of Dee's scryers in a long line of characters who Dee earnestly and optimistically employed to assist him in reaching truth with a capital T. Men like Kelly found their way into Dee's household past the watchful eye of his wife Jane. They lived under Dee's roof as a member of the family. They ate the food on his table, they read the books in his library, and they became financially dependent on the philosopher's, at times, very meager bank account. Edward Kelly, for instance, who may or may not have had both a criminal past and a connection to Oxford University, we can't be very certain about anything when we talk about Edward Kelly, convinced Dee that he was a great visionary, as well as an alchemist of some skill. In 1582, Kelly helped to push Dee's previous scryer, a man named Barnabas Saul, out of the household and proceeded to make himself indispensable to the philosopher thanks to his ability to communicate with angels in Dee's crystal showstone. And there's a number of showstones up on display, but this is the one that intrigues me. This is a stone that Kelly and Dee found, that was supposedly left for them in Mortlake by the angel Uriel. And the angel Uriel claimed that it was a stone that had remarkable healing powers. Now, one of the things that is always surprising about Dee and Kelly's relationship, but again, think about that earnestness and optimism, is that as Kelly wormed himself into the Dee household, he also wormed himself right into Dee's bedroom. In one of the most notorious moments of their relationship, the angels told Dee and Kelly that they should share everything between them, not just their food and their money, but also their wives. And again, in a moment of, I think, heroic understatement, Dee explained this to his wife. And he reported, "This doctrine was strange to the women." Which again, that kind of dead-on look at life. Not sensational in any way, but just sort of reporting the facts and only the facts. Kelly served as Dee's scryer until at least 1587, and Dee, again with his customary earnestness and optimism, kept records of all of their conversations. Some of them went on for 8 or 9 hours a day. So the two of them would be huddled around one of their stones for 8 or 9 hours. Jane Dee, John's wife, would come and knock on the door and call them to dinner. The children would be running around in the household, and on these conversations would go. We believe that Dee kept notes for all of his activities with scryers. I think he wanted a record of the truth when it was finally revealed to him. But it's mainly his conversations with Edward Kelly that have survived. These conversations were printed up in the late 17th century in an edition by Merritt Casaubon. And this catapulted Dee, after some 50 years after his death, back into the limelight, and I think firmly fixed his reputation as a magician in the eyes of the public. Polymathic natural philosophy of the kind that Dee was practicing was turning into a more recognizably modern science at the time, and fellows of the Royal Society like Robert Hooke could be scathing in their criticism of Dee's quaint interests in things like angels and crystal balls. Dr. Dee's delusion is how Robert Hooke described Dee's efforts to learn the ultimate truth of nature from the highest angelic sources. So I think it's a fair question then to wonder, what did John Dee really believe? Did he believe the geometry? Did he believe in the alchemy? Did he believe in the astrology? Did he believe in the angels? And my response would be to remind you again of his earnestness and optimism and say he believed in all of these things completely, and he believed that he could figure out how they fit together. And I think the evidence for that comes to me from his library. Because the thing that maybe we can all empathize with John Dee about here in this audience is that John Dee was a great reader. He loved his books. It may be hard for you to understand some of the other things that consumed him, but his love of books, I think, is something that probably everyone here in this room can empathize with on some level. And he found in his books the sort of intellectual challenges and the intellectual puzzle pieces that sustained his activities throughout his whole life. So it's in Dee's library that all of these strains of thought, the mathematics, the alchemy, the angels, all come together. We estimate that John Dee owned more than 4,000 volumes in his library, which made it the largest library in England at the time, larger than the libraries at Oxford and Cambridge combined. Dee collected his books from his student days at Cambridge right through to the end of his life. And he collected all sorts of books. He collected books on astronomy. He collected books about celestial events, and he made notations about his own witnessing of similar events. He was interested in astrology and in new heavenly bodies that were being spotted in the sky, and he wanted to understand what the significance of those celestial events were here on Earth. He was a fanatic historian. It's always one of the things I love best about him. He was interested in genealogies, local history, the history of England. Here we have him making notes in a book about the history of King Arthur. He collected books on basic sort of school curriculum subjects. In this case, it's oratory, rhetoric, foreign languages, language dictionaries. These were all sort of part of the tools of a philosopher. And he collected books that were old, as well as books that were new, books that were used and marked up, as well as, things that were coming straight off the presses. So one of the questions I have long had, and I think it's one that really most of what I've learned has come from Bill, is, okay, if you have 4,000 books and you're living in and you're not a prince, you're not living in a palace, where do you put them all? Especially you have multiple children, you have servants, you have people like Kelly living in the house. So what we know is actually disappointingly slight. There's talk about him having 4 or 5 rooms in his house dedicated to books. I think I got as far as imagining 4 or 5 rooms that were ringed with bookshelves, but I think it's probably more accurate to try to imagine those 4 or 5 rooms packed full with bookcases like this. This is the library at St. John's, Cambridge. That's where Dee went to school. The library actually postdates his time there. Maybe a better example is the library at Trinity Hall in Cambridge. I think he would have needed more vertical space than that. But to think about the ways in which these books, it wasn't like, you know, they were in a sort of display around the room. There's no way that household would have had the room to put all 4,000 of the books up against the wall. So space would have been at a premium with 4,000 or more books. And so the question then becomes, well then, once you got these books housed, how did Dee use them? And the evidence from the library books, including the evidence that you'll see upstairs, is that Dee interacted again with these books almost as though he was in conversation. Conversation is a really important word for Dee, I think. He conversed with authors, living and dead. He conversed with other experts in the margins of his books. And he converses with the larger questions of his time about how is the world organized and what is humanity's place in that world. So this is what we call the early modern worldview, this belief in an ordered hierarchical cosmos in which there are relationships between seemingly disconnected parts of the system. In almost all of Dee's books, there's evidence of him trying to make connections between the macrocosm, the great world, and the microcosm, his own world and his own experiences. And so he is very interested, for example, in the science of astrology, which was considered a higher science than astronomy in the period, because astronomy just told you how planets moved. Astrology taught you what the movement of those planets actually meant. He was a believer in an idea that the world was orderly, it was hierarchical. We see in those beliefs maybe the roots of his interest in mathematics. He was interested in reading the signs that he believed God had left in the world to be read and understood. So he was a keen observer of current events, whether it was the death of kings, as in this note about the death of Edward VI, or whether it was about the weather. He would have definitely had a weather station if he was alive and well and living today, and broadcasting it out on the net with his observations about what was going on in the weather. And he was, in so many of his books, even books that don't seem to have anything seemingly to do with angels and spirits, he was interested in what we would call the occult or hidden properties of nature. And so in this book, which is a universal history of cosmography, a history of the world, he's indicated down here a story about the vexation of evil spirits in the mines. There's it blown up. Angels and demons appear repeatedly in the margins of his books and in his underlining. And he collected books where other scholars were trying to grapple with the world of the invisible world, the world that was unseen but that people somehow sensed was with them all the time. And really, if you remember one thing as you go through the exhibition and as you leave tonight, if you forget all about how many books he owned or where he lived or anything else, what I want you to sort of take away and to try to remember is that while we normally talk about how John Dee's books shaped his worldview, which makes it sound like a very confined process, right, where his library sort of contained Dee and that was his microcosm, never forget the ways in which John Dee's books were a launching pad for him into a whole world of imagination and ideas. His books and his library were simply not large enough in the end to contain his own intellect and his own ambitions. And so he fills the margins of books with his own ideas. Here he's clearly thinking about a fantastic figure from Western history, the figure of Prester John, who was believed to have disappeared into Africa with news of Christianity and was still alive and living somewhere in the wilds of the continent and could be found again. So this is Dee's notes on that topic. His books were sometimes paper instruments that he could manipulate and he could use to sort of make whole new worlds appear. Even in books that don't seem to have room. This is a collection of Cicero's works. It wouldn't seem to, the books could have room for Dee to kind of experiment with his own thoughts and ideas. We get this amazing illustration of a ship. And in his own works, in his edition of that he worked on with Henry Billingsley of Euclid's Elements of Geometry, we see that sense of Dee's that somehow a book was the beginning of a whole new journey of the imagination and the intellect at work in these amazing pop-ups that seem to create their own little worlds rising up from the pages of Dee's books. So Dee's books were his friends. And so it's not a surprise to see so many friendly faces in them. And it's also not surprising that when we look at the exhibition and we catch a glimpse of these notes left so long ago by a polymath and conjurer and philosopher, that we get a sense of that same magical journey that Dee was on. And how his books were just the sort of the harbor out of which Dee sailed in his own imagination, in his own mind, just as this ship is sailing right off the page. So with that, I'm going to thank you and turn the podium over to Katie, who will share some more insights into the library.
Thank you. Deborah, thank you very much for a really scholarly but totally entertaining talk. It was excellent. Thank you.